Arthur Schopenhauer, a 19th century German philosopher, developed a deeply pessimistic view of the human condition, placing suffering and dissatisfaction at the core of his philosophy. To him, happiness, as most people understand it, is nothing but a fleeting illusion, something that constantly eludes us as we strive to fulfill our desires. Schopenhauer's central idea about happiness can be summed up in a simple yet devastating phrase. The relentless desire for happiness is, in fact, what makes us unhappy. This perspective contradicts the optimistic view of life, which believes happiness is within reach, as long as we find the right means to attain it. For Schopenhauer, the problem starts precisely in this process of searching. Human life is a constant struggle between unfulfilled desires and inevitable pain, in a cycle that never breaks. According to the philosopher, human beings are trapped in a continuous movement of longing and needs that are never fully satisfied. Once we achieve one goal, another desire emerges, another emptiness to be filled, and thus the cycle repeats endlessly. Happiness, in this context, is not something we can achieve in a stable or lasting way. On the contrary, it appears as a temporary escape from dissatisfaction. Schopenhauer proposes that the true human experience is one of constant tension, where the absence of pain is seen as a form of happiness, but never as a permanent state. Suffering is not only an inevitable part of life, but, in fact, the condition of existence. To him, pain and suffering are intrinsic to human nature, and the attempt to escape them is futile. Thus, the effort to attain happiness paradoxically becomes a path to unhappiness, as it is a movement that perpetuates desire and existential emptiness. In his main work, The World as Will and Representation, Schopenhauer describes desire as a blind and insatiable force that governs all living beings. Will, the force driving our desires, is the essence of being and the primary cause of all suffering. Each desire that arises in our mind and body is, in fact, a manifestation of this will that can never be fully satisfied. Even when we manage to fulfill a desire, the satisfaction that follows is fleeting and soon replaced by a new desire. The cycle of dissatisfaction and pain is, therefore, endless, leading individuals to live in a continuous state of frustration. For Schopenhauer, this cycle reflects a deeper truth about existence. Life is ultimately marked by will and the constant struggle to fulfill desires, a process that never provides definitive relief. Happiness, according to Schopenhauer, is a fleeting and rare experience, occurring only in the brief intervals between the fulfillment of one desire and the emergence of another. These moments of peace are like a pause in the relentless turmoil of will. However, the philosopher is clear in stating that this feeling of happiness cannot be considered true happiness, as it is not permanent. It is more an absence of suffering than a lasting positive experience. In other words, happiness manifests as temporary relief, not as a stable condition. Therefore, for Schopenhauer, the idea that we can reach a constant state of happiness is an illusion. Our pursuit of happiness is a quest for the unattainable, and constant dissatisfaction is part of our nature. Happiness, if it can even be called that, lies in the ability to endure pain and dissatisfaction with serenity, rather than trying to eliminate them. This view leads Schopenhauer to a radical conclusion about human life. Pain and suffering are not just undesirable elements to be avoided, but are part of the very structure of existence. Instead of incessantly seeking the elimination of suffering, Schopenhauer suggests that we must learn to accept it as an integral part of life. Suffering, in his analysis, is not something we can or should avoid. It is part of the cycle of will and desire, and attempting to escape it only reinforces the illusion that happiness is an achievable goal. Instead, true freedom lies in accepting pain, as a fundamental principle of human existence. What Schopenhauer proposes is not passive resignation, but a form of liberation through acceptance. By understanding that suffering is inevitable, we can, paradoxically, free ourselves from the tyranny of unfulfilled desires. Instead of fighting against pain, we can learn to integrate it into our lives in a more conscious and serene way. For Schopenhauer, art, aesthetic contemplation, and even philosophy can be ways to momentarily transcend will and desires, offering a break in the cycle of suffering. Through these practices, we can achieve a form of temporary liberation, allowing us to experience, at least for a time, the peace that seems beyond the reach of will. Thus, the acceptance of pain becomes, for Schopenhauer, an essential principle of philosophy. By understanding and accepting it, we can find a form of peace, albeit brief and transient. Suffering ceases to be a curse to be avoided and comes to be seen as an element that is part of our process of maturing and understanding life. Happiness, then, stops being an insane pursuit and becomes an experience that reveals itself in fleeting but profound moments in which we manage to transcend the will and reconcile, for moments, with the inevitability of suffering instead of a life dedicated to the relentless pursuit of pleasures and achievements. Schopenhauer suggests that we should focus on accepting suffering and understanding its inevitability. This does not mean passively resigning ourselves to pain, but accepting its presence as a fundamental part of existence. By doing so, we can, paradoxically, attain a form of serenity and freedom, a peace that comes from the deep understanding that true happiness is not in the fulfillment of desires, but in the acceptance of pain as an inseparable part of human life. According to Schopenhauer, the perception of reality is a deeply subjective phenomenon, an experience filtered through the lenses of our desires, beliefs, and past experiences. Every human being sees the world in a unique way, as the reality we perceive is not objective, but rather shaped by our personal interpretation, influenced by our needs and longings. Instead of living in direct contact with the world as it is, we are always filtering this experience through our own will and desires. For Schopenhauer, this distorted interpretation is an intrinsic characteristic of the human condition, as our view of the world is never entirely impartial. We are always projecting our own needs and aspirations onto what we see, creating a personal reality that often distances itself from the objective reality. This idea is central to Schopenhauer's philosophy. For him, reality is not something given, fixed, or static, but rather something that is in constant transformation, always at the mercy of our perceptions and desires. Our longings, in their most basic form, determine what we can perceive and how we interpret the events around us. When we desire something, our mind begins to project a series of expectations about how the world should be in order for that desire to be fulfilled, and this shapes our view of the present and the future. In many cases, what we perceive as reality is more a manifestation of our own desires than a faithful representation of the world as it truly is. This distorted perception of reality extends to the cycle of desires, which, for Schopenhauer, is the engine of human dissatisfaction. Each desire that arises is, by definition, unsatisfied until it is fulfilled. And once fulfilled, that desire gives way to another, creating a continuous cycle that prevents any form of lasting satisfaction. Happiness, then, is merely a momentary illusion, a fleeting pause between an unfulfilled desire and the next, never being a permanent or attainable condition. For Schopenhauer, human life is defined by this endless pursuit. By trying to satisfy our desires, we end up creating a dissatisfaction that never disappears. When we achieve something we desired, the relief is brief, and soon we find ourselves desiring something else, always in search of a new goal. The happiness we experience then is not constant happiness, but a temporary interruption of suffering, a gap between desire and its fulfillment. The solution Schopenhauer proposes to escape the cycle of incessant desires is not the absolute renunciation of will or desires, but rather the appreciation of simple and momentary pleasures, which offer an escape from the constant cycle of dissatisfaction. He suggests that by turning to experiences that are not directly related to the fulfillment of our most immediate desires, we can find genuine moments of serenity. Such moments, though brief, are precious, as they offer us a break from the ceaseless search for something we have yet to achieve. An example of this would be reading a good book, which allows the individual to temporarily escape their own desires and immerse themselves in the contemplation of a world of ideas, emotions, and stories that do not depend on the fulfillment of their longings. A peaceful walk through nature is another example of this temporary escape, where contact with the simple and immediate aspects of everyday life provides a sense of peace, without the need to reach a goal or fulfill a desire. These moments of simple pleasure, according to Schopenhauer, are powerful ways to interrupt the cycle of desire and find a form of contentment that does not depend on the permanent satisfaction of the will. They remind us that true peace does not come from the realization of grand desires, but from the ability to appreciate what is before us in the present moment without the need to constantly search for something more. It is these small pleasures, which are not tied to fulfilling expectations or achieving great goals, that offer a glimpse of true happiness, or rather, the absence of suffering, which Schopenhauer considers the only form of genuine happiness. However, Schopenhauer does not suggest that the solution to the problems of human life is simply the pursuit of moments of simple and carefree pleasure. The real issue lies in how we deal with suffering, how we face the inevitability of pain and dissatisfaction. Ultimately, physical and mental health becomes a fundamental aspect of the search for any form of lasting peace. Health, both of the body and the mind, is the foundation that allows us to face life's challenges in a more balanced way, without being dominated by the incessant cycle of desires and frustrations. For Schopenhauer, a person's physical and mental condition directly influences the way they perceive and interact with the world. Physical pain and mental anguish can intensify the perception of suffering, making it more difficult to escape the insatiable will that governs our desires. Therefore, caring for the body and mind is not just a matter of well-being, but of preparing to face the suffering of life more effectively. The pursuit of health, whether through physical exercise, meditation, or practices that promote mental balance, is a way to cultivate greater resilience to suffering, which in turn allows us to better enjoy the moments of serenity that arise sporadically in a world where the relentless pursuit of desire fulfillment seems to be the engine of human existence. Schopenhauer invites us to reflect on the nature of happiness and how we deal with suffering. He proposes that true peace does not come from the achievement of our desires, but from accepting the impermanence of happiness and the ability to find pleasure in life's simple things. Ultimately, physical and mental health becomes the key to dealing with the inevitability of suffering, allowing us, at least for moments, to escape the endless cycle of will and find genuine peace not in the satisfaction of desires, but in the tranquil acceptance of life as it is. In his philosophy, Schopenhauer develops a deep reflection on the relationship between will and intellect, which is central to understanding his view of the human condition. For the philosopher, human will is the fundamental force driving our actions and desires, and by its very nature, it is irrational and blind. The will does not submit to reason or intellect, but operates independently of logic or rationality. It is a primal and impersonal force that manifests in humans as a constant pursuit of satisfaction, an incessant desire that never finds rest. In this sense, will is pure impulsivity, an instinctive movement aimed only at the immediate fulfillment of longings, without regard for consequences or reason. In contrast, intellect, for Schopenhauer, is the human faculty that attempts to organize and justify the actions of the will. The intellect is rational, logical, and reflective, but it often finds itself in the position of justifying the impulsive actions of the will, never fully able to control or redirect it. The dynamic between will and intellect is, therefore, marked by a fundamental disconnect. While will acts impulsively and irrationally, the intellect tries to make sense of and justify this irrationality. This disconnection between the two aspects of our nature is one of the causes of human suffering, because the intellect, by attempting to justify the actions of the will, ends up perpetuating the cycle of desires and frustrations without achieving true peace or lasting satisfaction. Recognizing this dynamic is, for Schopenhauer, a crucial step toward living with greater self-awareness. When we realize that our will operates independently of the intellect, and that the rational justifications we give for our actions often amount to a form of self-deception, we begin to understand the nature of our dissatisfaction. By distancing ourselves from blind identification with our desires and recognizing this separation between will and intellect, we can gain a deeper understanding of our own life and true nature. This self-knowledge is essential for us to finally reduce the impact of the will on our actions and find a way to live with more balance and serenity. Schopenhauer does not develop his philosophy in isolation, but engages with Eastern philosophical and spiritual traditions, which also address the issue of suffering and desire. The German philosopher was deeply influenced by Buddhism and Hinduism, particularly by the view that suffering is inevitable and that the only way to overcome it is through detachment from desires and acceptance of pain as an essential part of life. This conception is reflected in Schopenhauer's own thinking, as he sees desire as the source of all human suffering. For him, the only way to achieve serenity is to learn to live without the incessant desire for satisfaction, accepting suffering as an inescapable reality. Buddhism, with its emphasis on overcoming desire nirvana and accepting suffering as part of the cycle of birth and death samsara, resonates deeply with Schopenhauer's ideas. Both philosophical systems view desire as the fundamental cause of suffering and advocate that liberation comes from renouncing it. Acceptance of pain and understanding its inevitability are seen as a path to achieving a deeper form of peace, which does not depend on external conditions, but on an internal shift in perception of reality. By embracing these influences, Schopenhauer proposes that by accepting pain and desires as inextricable from our nature, we can find a serene peace that transcends the insatiable pursuit of happiness. This philosophy of accepting pain, influenced by Eastern teachings, leads to the conclusion that life should be seen as a unique and meaningful work of art. For Schopenhauer, every human experience, even painful ones, contributes to the totality of life, which should be appreciated in its complexity. Life is not a linear process of successes and failures, but a creation that unfolds uniquely, with ups and downs, light and shadow. Accepting everything that life offers us, without trying to force permanent happiness or escape from pain, is a way of living artistically, recognizing that the beauty of life lies in its entirety, with all its contradictions and complexities. Viewing life as a work of art means perceiving that, even amidst suffering, there is a meaning that can only be found when we accept the totality of the human experience. There is no need to reject pain or sadness, as they are equally essential parts of this work we are constantly creating. When we live with awareness of ourselves and our true nature, we can find beauty even in the most difficult moments, like an artist who knows to value shadow just as much as light in their painting. For Schopenhauer, life should not be seen as a series of achievements or the pursuit of an illusory happiness, but as a unique expression of the will, which, in its irrationality, gives rise to all our experiences. In the end, Schopenhauer's philosophy invites us to a profound reflection on the nature of life, desire, and suffering. By integrating Eastern influences and the analysis of the disconnection between will and intellect, he shows us that the acceptance of pain and desires, far from being a form of resignation, is a path to living with greater awareness and freedom. Life, with all its difficulties and beauty, should be appreciated as an ever-evolving work of art, where each moment, whether of pleasure or suffering, contributes to the totality of our experience.